1. Introduction. RFK. The United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only. For home building and furniture building. For just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable. Wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree, but it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burned tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lungs, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom, the Eco-Design Wood Stove, and International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. RFK. Purple air PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.
Hi, my name is Lily. Andrew gave you the intro to residents against wood smoke emission particulates and their concern for air pollution from indoor residential wood burning. Residents against wood smoke emission particulates, or ROSEP, would like every near neighbor of an indoor residential wood burner whose wood smoke enters their yards and sickens the near neighbors to have a purple air PM 2.5 monitor hanging from the eaves of their home to measure the level of PM 2.5 entering their yards. That measurement of air pollution should be used as evidence of unnecessary air pollution, and each indoor residential wood burner should be shut down based on that evidence, one indoor residential wood burner at a time if necessary. The presentation by Andrew ended at 2 minutes 5 seconds. The same presentation by Emma starts at 2 minutes 3 seconds before the end of this podcast. So I am Lily, your timekeeper, and you can start the next podcast at 2 minutes 5 seconds in if you would not like to see the presentation by Andrew a second time. This presentation by me, Lily, ends at 5 minutes in. What you will see in the main content of this ROSEP podcast will be news about air pollution from indoor residential wood burning and how that air pollution is being combated by ordinary people just like you who are unfortunately near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners at this time. There will also be news about unnecessary and highly polluting use of wood as fuel in industrial wood burners and preventable air pollution from wood burning wildfires. There will also be news about air pollution from PM 2.5 from gas-powered cars. There will also be news about airborne diseases which are also preventable with vaccines such as COVID-19 and measles and whooping cough, to name just a few. In 2025, residents against wood smoke emission particulates is also concerned with combating the Trump destruction of government funding for programs which protect human health through the Department of Health and Human Services, and Trump destruction of programs which fund the science and medical research plan to protect human health from preventable illnesses. Protecting human health is a patriotic act, and our defense against enemies is weakened if we are not as healthy as we can be. Heat pump rebates are now offered by the federal government, distributed through the eligible United States, are available in 2025 and are the best, cleanest, and now cheapest alternative to indoor residential wood burning if that burning is actually done to purportedly save money. Wind and solar as sources of the electricity that powers heat pumps and electric cars is also cheaper than burning wood. The adverse health effects that are caused by indoor residential wood burning also come at a cost to near neighbors, both in shortening and ending their lives and in actual hospital, clinic, and funeral costs. Instead of being compensated monetarily, near neighbors should instead be able to achieve immediate relief by stopping indoor residential wood burning in their hyper-localized neighborhoods, which relief readings from purple air PM 2.5 monitors used as evidence of air pollution will help them achieve. Welcome to news about hopeful scientific and medical achievements that will also help us achieve the goal of clean air to breathe.
Episode 57DHXWU, August 28, 2025 COVID shots for U.S. people over 65 years old, RFK Junior says. In episode 57DHXWU1, RFK Junior FDA approves updated COVID vaccines with new restrictions. Trump starts investigation that could lead to tariffs on wind turbines. The tariffs would hamper a clean energy industry that the president has often railed against. Trump, with tariffs and threats, tries to strong-arm nations to retreat on climate goals. The president has made no secret of his distaste for wind and solar in America. Now he is taking his fossil fuel agenda overseas. 4 states vow to fight Trump. The official stop work order on offshore wind farm. Rhode Island and Connecticut officials say project slated to power 350,000 homes is essential to their climate goals. 5. Do not let Donald Trump undermine your faith in the climate fight. By Gina McCarthy. The Trump fossil fuel obsession cannot stop global progress, writes the former Environmental Protection Agency head. 6. A coal-fired plant in Michigan was to close, but Trump forced it to keep running. A town had big plans for the facility site until the Trump administration ordered it to stay open, a move it extended this week. 7. Headlines. Main content. 0. RFK airborne COVID-19 and airborne fossil fuel PM 2.5 emissions are threats to human health, just as airborne PM 2.5 emissions from indoor residential wood burning and industrial wood burning are threats to human health. COVID-19 vaccinations with mRNA vaccines have saved millions of lives and will save millions of lives in the future if they are authorized for wide use by the United States government. In the future, wind power is clean energy, and the only reason Trump is blocking wind power in the United States is to give a competitive advantage to air-polluting fossil fuels to boost fossil fuel profits at the expense of human health. 1. RFK Junior FDA approves updated COVID vaccines with new restrictions. RFK people 65 and older are authorized to receive COVID-19 vaccines this fall. Key excerpts. This would mark the first fall-winter season that COVID shots were not widely recommended to most people and children, pitting federal health officials in the Trump administration against several national medical groups that oppose the restrictions. Many public health experts view the changes as part of the Kennedy broader campaign against certain vaccines, especially his targeting of mRNA technology, which has been used in the vast majority of shots administered to Americans. They criticized his recent cancellation of $500 million in grants to study flu and COVID vaccines as a move that would significantly set back American efforts to develop better therapies and leave the nation reliant on older, slower approaches. Excerpts edited by Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, August 27, 2025. The Food and Drug Administration on Wednesday approved updated COVID vaccines for the fall season and limited who can get the shots, most restrictive policy of the federal government since the vaccines became available. The agency authorized the vaccines for people who are 65 and older. Younger people would only be eligible if they had at least one underlying medical condition that would put them at risk for severe disease. Healthy children under 18 could still receive the shots if a medical provider is consulted. People seeking the shots will soon face another hurdle. An influential advisory committee to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention must vote to recommend them, but that the makeup of the panel shifted when Health Secretary Kennedy Jr. unseated existing members, reduced the size of the panel, and added some COVID vaccine opponents. In a social media post, Kennedy said the approvals accomplish the goals of keeping vaccines available to people who want them and of demanding that companies conduct placebo-controlled trials. One new required study would examine post-COVID-19 vaccination syndrome in patients, a condition that has been noted in at least one small preliminary medical report, but is still a matter of pitch debate. Those efforts have been tempered to some degree by the White House, where President Trump remains proud of Operation Warp Speed, which was widely recognized as an impressive feat of science, organization, and execution to develop and deliver vaccines that helped bring the pandemic to an end. The FDA, a new limited approval, covers 2 vaccines designed with mRNA that were updated to target the LP.8.1 variant, which represents nearly 1/3 of recent cases. The Moderna vaccine authorization covers those who are 6 months old and older and have medical conditions, and all people over 65. The Pfizer shot was approved for the same group, ages 5 and older. The agency also approved the protein-based Novavax vaccine, which is matched to the Omicron strain JN.1, which the mRNA vaccines targeted last year. The company said the shots continue to offer high levels of antibodies. The FDA revoked emergency authorizations for the vaccines in children, which would make the Pfizer shot unavailable for children younger than 5, and the rates of vaccine use have dropped in recent years to about 23% among all adults and to 13% of people younger than 18, according to the CDC. A decision by the CDC panel is expected within a month, and it could greatly influence access to the shots at drugstore sites, which have become the most convenient places to get them. Laws in a number of states, including California, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Massachusetts, require that pharmacy staff are only permitted to administer vaccines recommended by the CDC, along with the new eligibility limits. Pharmacists are raising concerns over their role in an era of increasing vaccine restrictions. I am hearing from pharmacists who are fearful they might be in legal jeopardy for providing vaccines, said Michael Osterholm, a University of Minnesota epidemiologist. We have created this environment of fear for vaccine administration. Kennedy has upended decades of vaccine policy at the CDC in recent months, replacing infectious disease experts with some members who have vehemently opposed the mRNA COVID vaccines. Kennedy, who spent nearly 20 years working as an anti-vaccine activist before entering government, also has the final say over the panel recommendations. The National Association of Chain Drugstores is carefully watching the CDC next move, given that about 90% of COVID shots were administered in pharmacies in recent years, a CVS Health spokesman said. It has continued to offer eligible patients COVID vaccines, but would review the new Federal guidelines for now CVS said pregnant women and children would be able to get COVID shots. A number of professional groups have already begun to issue advice that diverges from recent changes under the watch of RFK Jr. In May, the RFK Junior CDC dropped the recommendation that pregnant women receive the COVID shots, a move that could limit insurance coverage and availability at pharmacies. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists took a different stance, advising women to get the COVID vaccine to protect themselves and their infants who cannot be immunized until they are 6 months old. Large studies have found that vaccination reduces the risk of maternal death or stillbirth during pregnancy. Though RFK Junior CDC data collection has fallen off, reports of COVID deaths have fallen sharply in July, a month when case counts tend to be low. The CDC reported roughly 170 deaths a week this year. Last year, there were about 550 to 850 deaths a week in July. Still, lawmakers in several states, including Maryland, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, have taken legislative steps to safeguard their ability to provide vaccines regardless of federal policies, and state health officials in the Northeast and beyond met recently to discuss paths forward in the case of altered federal vaccine policies. Cases of COVID have ticked up in recent weeks, particularly among children from newborns to age 11. CDC data show children made up the group with the highest rates of COVID in emergency rooms, with 3.5% of those from birth to age 11 testing positive in recent weeks, 10 times the rate in May. Traditionally, the FDA has issued broad approvals to vaccines and passed the baton to the CDC, which convenes experts who issue recommendations on which groups should receive the doses. Those teams tend to carefully weigh the risk of the disease and any safety concerns that emerge about the vaccine. FDA officials announced a new approach in May, narrowing access to COVID vaccines, which they described in an essay in the New England Journal of Medicine and EJM. To address the concern, they asked COVID vaccine makers to study the vaccine in 50 to 64-year-olds with a focus on comparing symptomatic disease, severe illness, hospitalization, and death to those who were given a placebo. In the meantime, the COVID vaccines are restricted among those younger than 65 to people with one of a long list of underlying conditions, including depression, obesity, diabetes, or physical inactivity. The FDA also included pregnancy as a condition that elevates the risk of severe disease. Kennedy followed that news with his own announcement, standing in for the CDC process, ultimately leaving pregnant women off the vaccine schedule and concluding that children could get it after a conversation with a healthcare provider. The decision was widely panned by medical experts, including Dr. Paul Offit, a vaccine expert and pediatrician. He said that the Kennedy justification for restricting vaccines from pregnant women, detailed in a letter to Congress, misrepresented medical studies and would fail a 10th grade science class. Soon after, 6 leading medical groups sued the Department of Health and Human Services, saying the decision would result in preventable deaths, including the unborn and newborns under 6 months old. The case is pending to Trump starts investigation that could lead to tariffs on wind turbines. The tariffs would hamper a clean energy industry that the president has often railed against. Excerpts edited by Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, August 21, 2025. Since taking office, President Trump has railed against wind power and the turbines that are needed to generate that energy. He has called the turbines ugly and inefficient and criticized them for ruining landscapes as well as endangering whales and birds. So it was curious when on Thursday the administration announced a trade investigation that could result in tariffs on imported wind turbines. The Trump administration has typically imposed tariffs to protect American companies against foreign competition and spur domestic production of critical products. This time, laying out a path to impose tariffs could be an attempt to stymie an industry. A federal filing released on Thursday showed that the Trump administration had initiated an investigation into foreign wind turbines. On August 13, Trump began the inquiry under a legal provision known as Section 232, which allows the president to apply tariffs to foreign products if their imports threaten national security. Trump has already used the provision to apply steep tariffs to cars, steel, aluminum, and copper, and is threatening further such tariffs on semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and airplanes. Analysts at Capstone, a strategic consulting firm, said the investigation into wind turbines and their components would raise the price of imported materials that wind projects depend on. They said they believe the investigation was an attempt to further hamper wind build-out. The analyst said that tariffs would be especially painful for developers of offshore wind projects like those underway in New York, since they tend to rely more heavily on imports. Trump has frequently criticized wind turbines despite the fact that they are a major source of energy in Republican-led states like Iowa, Oklahoma, and Texas. The administration has pushed for the use of oil and gas rather than cleaner sources of energy and recently released a slew of measures aimed at slowing both wind and solar installations by raising the cost of imported wind turbines. Tariffs would make wind energy more expensive compared with other types of energy. The United States imported wind components worth $2.83 billion last year, mostly from the European Union, Mexico, and India. Capstone said wind power and solar power provided 16% of the electricity in America last year and are some of the fastest growing sources of power. Free Trump with tariffs and threats tries to strong-arm nations to retreat on climate goals. The president has made no secret of his distaste for wind and solar in America. Now he is taking his fossil fuel agenda overseas. Excerpts edited by Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, August 27, 2025. President Trump is not only working to stop a transition away from fossil fuels in the United States, he is pressuring other countries to relax their pledges to fight climate change and instead burn more oil, gas, and coal. Trump, who has joined with Republicans in Congress to shred federal support for electric vehicles and for solar and wind energy, is applying tariffs, levies, and other mechanisms of the biggest economy in the world to induce other countries to burn more fossil fuels. His animus is particularly focused on the wind industry, which is a well-established and growing source of electricity in Several European countries, as well as in China and Brazil 2 weeks ago, the administration promised to punish countries by applying tariffs, visa restrictions, and port fees that vote for a global agreement to slash greenhouse gas emissions from the shipping sector. Days later, in Geneva, the Trump administration joined Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing countries to oppose limits on the production of petroleum-based plastics. Last month, the Trump administration struck a trade deal with the European Union, in which it agreed to reduce some tariffs if the bloc purchased $750 billion in American oil and gas over 3 years. That deal has raised concerns in some European countries because it would conflict with plans to reduce the use of fossil fuels, the burning of which is the main driver of climate change. They are clearly using various tools in an attempt to increase the use of fossil fuels around the world instead of decrease. Jennifer Morgan, the former special envoy for climate action in Germany, said also last month Trump Energy Secretary Chris Wright warned that the United States could pull out of the International Energy Agency after the organization predicted that global oil demand would peak this decade. Instead of continue to climb, Europe narrowly avoided a trade war with Trump by agreeing, among other things, to purchase $750 billion in crude oil, natural gas, other petroleum derivatives, and nuclear reactor fuel over 3 years on an annual basis. That would amount to more than 3 times the amount the bloc bought last year from the United States. You see a more systematic attempt to be a fossil fuel first strategy to everything that they do, said a director of international programs at the Natural Resources Defense Council, an environmental group. The administration may slow the transition to clean energy by other countries, but cannot stop it. Schmidt said most countries that signed the Paris Agreement will submit more ambitious targets for reducing their greenhouse gas emissions to the United Nations this year, although some may temper those plans because of the U.S. position, he said. 4 states vow to fight the Trump official stop work order on offshore wind farm. Rhode Island and Connecticut officials say project slated to power 350,000 homes is essential to their climate goals. ROSEP key excerpt: the Trump U.S. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management sent the wind farm firm a letter on Friday ordering it to halt all ongoing activities. In particular, BOEM is seeking to address concerns related to the protection of national security interests in the United States. Matt Jacona, the acting director of BOEM, adding that Arsted may not resume activities until the agency has completed a review of the project. Jacona said that the project, which had already cleared years of federal and state reviews, now needs to be re-examined in light of the Trump order on the first day of his second term to consider terminating or amending any existing wind energy leases. Green Ocean's a nonprofit that opposes the offshore wind industry and sued in federal court last year to stop the 8,3798-acre, 33,912-hectare Revolution Wind project on environmental grounds. Applauded the decision. We are grateful that the Trump administration and the federal government are taking meaningful action to preserve the fragile ocean environment off the coasts of Rhode Island and Massachusetts, the nonprofit said in a statement. ROSEP view the real objective of Green Oceans may be to prop up the fossil fuel industry by eliminating wind power. Clean energy options for powering homes and industries. Excerpts edited by Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, August 25, 2025. The Democratic governors of Rhode Island and Connecticut promised on Saturday to fight a Trump administration order halting work on a nearly complete wind farm off their coasts that was expected to be operational next year. The Revolution Wind project was about 80% complete, with 45 of its 65 turbines already installed. According to the Danish wind farm developer Ørsted, wind power is the largest source of renewable energy in the U.S. and provides about 10% of the electricity generated in the nation. This is the second major offshore wind project the Trump White House has halted. Work was previously stopped on Empire Wind, a New York offshore wind project, but construction was allowed to resume after Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, and Senator Chuck Schumer intervened. This administration has it exactly backwards. It is trying to prop up clunky, polluting coal plants while doing all it can to halt the fastest growing energy sources of the future, solar and wind power. Kit Kennedy, managing director for the Power Division at the Natural Resources Defense Council, said in a statement, unfortunately, every American is paying the price for these misguided decisions. 5. Do not let Donald Trump undermine your faith in the climate fight. By Gina McCarthy. The Trump fossil fuel obsession cannot stop global progress, writes the former Environmental Protection Agency head. Excerpts edited by Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The Guardian, August 24, 2025. Over the past decade, the United States has turned technologies into tools that strengthened our economy, delivered good-paying union jobs, cleaned up our air and water, conserved our precious natural resources, and saved families money all across our country. Yet now the country is choosing to see that leadership, letting China dominate and control the clean energy market across the world. Trump is obsessed with fossil fuels. He wants to resuscitate what everyone knows is a dying coal sector while turning a blind eye to the health, environmental, and economic downsides of the climate crisis. States and institutions are still fighting in court when this administration disregards science and weakens federal efforts to protect people and our environment. Folks are still listening and speaking up at neighborhood gatherings, town hall meetings, and public hearings on issues like the weakening of air, water, and power plant pollution rules that increase risks to families. They are still fighting for our lives, our communities, and our democracy. States, cities, and local communities have authority to act boldly and work with industries to advance market innovation and install clean energy that creates jobs and lowers the cost of living for families. They still have clean vehicle fleets for cities to purchase and EV charging projects to pursue. They still have tax credits for solar, wind, and batteries. There is more than a decade of geothermal and battery storage tax credits available for cities, schools, and health clinics, as well as many more clean energy opportunities. We can and must grab. California, the 4th largest economy in the world, ran on clean energy for 219 days last year. Florida built more large-scale solar infrastructure than California last year. Even in oil country, Texas is setting records for solar, wind, and battery capacity. More than 40 states have green banks and clean energy financing institutions. 24 states are committed to the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. They are developing bilateral climate partnerships with countries that understand the threat of the climate crisis and the opportunity that clean energy provides. U.S. leaders I have worked with for decades during international climate negotiations Continue to work with colleagues in the United Nations, the European Union, India, China development banks, and the private sector to identify policies and strategies that allow the world to mobilize capital for climate projects. Why? Because the cost of not investing in resilience and decarbonization is far too high. Mike Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies have given our country a seat at the global table. America is all in partnering with the U.S. Climate Alliance Climate Mayor Series, and others will be at the forthcoming UN climate negotiations in Brazil to showcase leadership on infrastructure, transportation, buildings, land use, and more that protects our communities and cuts pollution. Mayors and governors will use this platform to inform negotiations, build new partnerships, and pursue creative financing for more projects at home, while U.S. investors continue to explore opportunities to address the heartbreaking food and water challenges across the global south. 84% of corporations are standing by their commitments to cut carbon pollution, and 37% are increasing their ambitions, according to PwC. Because they know that climate solutions are good for business, the first quarter of 2025 was the second strongest ever for U.S. clean energy, representing $10 billion in domestic investments across the globe. Investments in clean tech are slated to reach $2.2 trillion this year, twice the amount for coal, gas, and oil. To stay competitive, meet rising energy demand, stop utility bills from soaring, and tackle aging infrastructure, we need more clean energy, battery storage, and energy efficiency, not less. These technologies are cheaper to build and operate than fossil fuels. 93% of new electric generating capacity this year is projected to come from solar, wind, and batteries, according to the Trump-owned Energy Department. Facts are facts, no matter how much the administration tries to prop up the fossil fuel industry. U.S. states, cities, communities, businesses, and institutions know that the world is not as Trump defines it. Clean energy is and must be our future. Gina McCarthy is the managing co-chair of America is All in, former White House National Climate Advisor and 13th U.S. EPA Administrator. 6A coal-fired plant in Michigan was to close, but Trump forced it to keep running. A town had big plans for the facility site until the Trump administration ordered it to stay open. A move it extended this week. Excerpts edited by Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The Guardian, August 21st, 2025. Donald Trump has made several unusual moves to elongate the era of coal, such as giving the industry exemptions from pollution rules. But the gambit to keep one Michigan coal-fired power station running has been extraordinary by forcing it to remain open even against the wishes of its operator, the hulking J.H. Campbell Power Plant, which since 1962 has sat a few hundred yards from the sand dunes at the edge of Lake Michigan, was just 8 days away from a long-planned closure in May when the Trump Department of Energy issued an emergency order that it remain open for a further 90 days. On Wednesday, the administration intervened again to extend this order even further, prolonging the lifetime of the coal plant another 90 days, meaning it will keep running until November, 6 months after it was due to close. The move, taken under emergency powers more normally used during wartime or in the wake of disaster, has stunned local residents and the operator of the plant, Consumers Energy. My family had a countdown for it closing. We could not wait, said Mark Oppenwisen, who has lived in the shadow of the plant for 30 years and suspects its pollution worsened the lung disease of his wife. I was flabbergasted when the administration said they had stopped it shutting down. He said, why are they inserting themselves into a decision a company has made just because you do not like it politically? It is all so dumb. The May 23rd order and the latest edict by the U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright both warned that the regional grid would be strained by the closure of J.H. Campbell, with local homes and businesses at risk of curtailments or outages, presenting a risk to public health and safety. Without it, but MISO, the grid operator for Michigan and 14 other states, has stressed it has had adequate resources to meet peak demand this summer without J.H. Campbell, and Consumers Energy had already set about making plans for life after its last remaining coal plant. / What is remarkable is that this is the first time the Energy Secretary has used these powers without being asked to do so by the market operator or power plant operator, said Timothy Fox, an energy analyst at Clearview. It shows the Trump administration is prepared to take muscular actions to keep its preferred power sources online. The battle over the future of the coal plant has taken place to a backdrop of a scorching summer in Michigan, one of its hottest on record, with algal blooms sprouting in its lakes, both symptoms of an unfolding climate crisis. The talk in neighborhoods has been how hot it has been this summer, said Stephen Wooden, a Democratic state lawmaker, who added that Michigan residents are also pissed off about increasing power bills. We are seeing the impacts of climate change daily. It is impacting our state, Wooden said, and this is being caused by the continuation of outdated, expensive fossil fuels that Donald Trump wants to prop up. Headline, August 27th, 2025. Iowa Public Radio. Iowa Democrat first-time Democratic candidate Caitlin Dray breaks a Republican supermajority in the Iowa Senate. Iowa Public Radio. Headlines, The New York Times, August 27th, 2025. Air pollution. Trump starts investigation that could lead to tariffs on wind turbines. The New York Times. Air pollution. Trump with tariffs and threats tries to strong-arm nations to retreat on climate goals. The New York Times. Business after U.S. takes stake in Intel. Trump pledges many more deals. The New York Times. Business workers who lost jobs to trade needed help. Washington cut the funding. The New York Times. Democrats' opinion, the rise of the Democratic National Security Mom. The New York Times. Economy. The AI spending frenzy is propping up the real economy. 2. The New York Times. Electric vehicle versus gas car calculator. The New York Times. Games. Gen Z and millennials find offline joy in board game clubs. The New York Times. Games. The Trump tariffs become a wild card for board game makers. The New York Times. Illinois deploy National Guard to Chicago. Trump says he has the right to do anything I want to do. The New York Times. Louisiana FEMA opinion. This is why New Orleans never recovered from Katrina. The New York Times. Media. As PBS stations confront cuts, American history takes a hit. The New York Times. Media opinion. Google could get broken up this week for antitrust violations. Here is what it would mean. The New York Times. Minnesota violence live updates. Suspect identified in Minneapolis school shooting that killed 2 children and injured 14. The New York Times. Minnesota violence. Minneapolis Catholic school shooting. Live updates. Suspect identified in attack that killed 2 children and injured 14. The New York Times. Nature. This golden arsenic deep sea worm fights poison with poison. The New York Times. Nature. How the pygmy seahorse lost its snout. The New York Times. RFK Junior. FDA approves updated COVID vaccines with new restrictions. RFK Junior. Opinion make America healthy again, even if it gets you sick. The New York Times. RFK Jr. Where U.S. medicines are made and how the Trump tariffs could affect them. The New York Times. RFK Jr. Why experts caution against Pete Hegseth and the RFK Jr. fitness challenge. The New York Times. Trump opinion. Donald the Trump assault on capitalism. The New York Times. Trump opinion. All the things Trump thinks. He owns. The New York Times. Trump opinion. The Supreme Court must limit this president. Start with the Fed. The New York Times. Trump plays reality television. Host a cabinet meeting that lasts hours. The New York Times. Trump again escalates power grabs in bid to fire Fed member. The New York Times. The Trump appointees could rule the Fed for decades. The New York Times. World maps tracking the Trump new tariffs on every country. The New York Times. Europe opinion. Europe has found its formula for managing Trump. The New York Times. Europe is spending big on defense. Will that help its ailing economy? The New York Times. Russia. Why have not sanctions on Russia stopped the war? The money is still flowing. The New York Times. India. How the Trump tariffs on India could make diamonds more expensive for the U.S. The New York Times. India. Trump raises tariffs on India to 50% over Russian oil. The New York Times. India reels at the Trump highest tariffs, yet the New York Times. Headlines. The New York Times. August 26, 2025. Democrats. Gates Foundation quietly cuts ties with firm linked to Democrats. The New York Times. Democrats opinion. Small bookstores and the future of liberalism. The New York Times. Economy. Purging equity programs. GOP defunded its own roads. The New York Times. Economy. Stock market reaction is muted after the Trump threats to Lisa Cook and the Fed. The New York Times. Fed and Trump mortgage fraud claims give Trump weapon against Lisa Cook and others. The New York Times. Fed and Trump opinion. Where is your evidence? Trump. The New York Times. Fed and Trump again escalates power grabs in bid to fire Fed member. The New York Times. Fed and Trump. Live updates. Fed defends independence as Lisa Cook plans to challenge firing. The New York Times. Fed and Trump attempt to fire the Lisa Cook of the Fed risks global economic stability. The New York Times. Media public broadcast cuts hit rural areas revealing a political shift. The New York Times. Music. Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce are engaged. Singer announces. The New York Times. Music timeline and big moments of the Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce relationship. The New York Times. Music engagement ring of Taylor Swift marks a return to vintage elegance. The New York Times. RFK Jr. human case of flesh-eating screwworm reported in Maryland. The New York Times. Science Rainer Weiss who gave a nod to Einstein and the Big Bang dies at 92. The New York Times. Trump opinion. The Trump influence on our language. The New York Times. Trump plays reality television. Host a cabinet meeting that lasts hours. The New York Times. Trump threatens to investigate Chris Christie over Bridgegate. The New York Times. Universities. The typical American college student is not who you think. The New York Times. Brazil opinion. Brazil, India, and other countries fight back against the Trump tariffs. The New York Times. Russia and Democrats blamed for investigating Trump. Justice Department broadens inquiry into key players in Russia investigation. The New York Times. Headlines. The New York Times. August 24th, 2025. Artificial intelligence opinion. How ChatGPT surprised me. The New York Times. Business fearing customs chaos. DHL joins others in suspending U.S. shipments. The New York Times. Business opinion. What is Trump hiding in his comprehensive federal budget proposal? The New York Times. Democrats reframing Jan 6th after the pardons. The purge. The New York Times. Democrats. It is time for Americans to start talking about soft secession. Fed and Trump. Fed officials try to keep focus on economy as Trump intensifies attacks. The New York Times. Illinois. After the Trump threat to send National Guard to Chicago, Democrats push back. The New York Times. New York opinion. What Jesse Jackson and Zoran Mamdani have in common. The New York Times. RFK Jr. opinion. Trump is defunding medical research. It could cost you your life. The New York Times. RFK Jr. insurance companies send chilling letters just before surgery. But why? The New York Times. Texas opinion. The Trump stunning power grab on elections. The New York Times. Trump opinion. We can disagree on the Trump motives, but a pattern is still emerging. The New York Times. Ukraine. Zelensky marks the Ukraine Independence Day with diplomacy in Kiev and a plea for peace. The New York Times. Ukraine peace talks in Ukraine all lead to the Donbass. The New York Times. Headlines. The New York Times. August 21st, 2025. Air pollution. A funeral director brought wind power to Rockport, Missouri. The New York Times. Excerpts edited by residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. AI overview. Funeral director Eric Chamberlain spearheaded the development of a wind energy project in Rockport, Missouri in the early 2000s, transforming the town into the first U.S. community to generate more electricity from wind than it consumed. The project, which began with 4 turbines in 2008, was a significant economic boon for the rural area, providing tax revenue, jobs, and predictable income for landowners, and continues to power the town today. The genesis of wind power in Rockport, an idea on the road in the early 2000s. Eric Chamberlain, a funeral director, saw wind turbines in Iowa while driving back from a funeral and was inspired to bring similar technology to his hometown of Rockport. A proactive approach. The family of Chamberlain had operated the funeral home in Rockport since 1968, and he used his deep connection to the community and his understanding of its economic needs to champion the wind project. The success of the project, first in the nation in 2008, Rockport became the first city in the United States to own a wind energy project capable of generating more power than it needed. A major economic shift. The wind project brought significant economic benefits to the county, including millions in annual tax revenues, creation of dozens of jobs, and consistent lease payments to farmers. Lasting impact. Economic resilience. The wind power has provided a stable income for agricultural communities vulnerable to devastating floods and storms, helping to change the local economy. A model for the future. The wind energy success story of Rockport serves as an example of what the energy transition can look like at a local level, demonstrating the power of community and Determination air pollution, how native homes in New Mexico are tapping the sun. The New York Times air pollution and energy, how West Virginia is pulling pollution and rare earths out of its streams. The New York Times air pollution, Ohio. In Ohio, a solar co-op helps families go solar for less. The New York Times air pollution, Trump starts investigation that could lead to tariffs on wind turbines. The New York Times air pollution, Nevada is all in on solar power. The New York Times artificial intelligence, Madison Avenue is starting to love AI. The New York Times business, investors expect the NVIDIA earnings to move the S&P more than the speech of Powell. The New York Times business, the NVIDIA Jensen Huang in talks with China to allay security fears over AI chips. The New York Times business, Walmart sees sales momentum despite tariffs. The New York Times business, paint, pottery and profitable leases, experiential retail that works. The New York Times California air pollution picket fire forces evacuations in Napa County. The New York Times California Gavin the Newsom redistricting ballot fight raises $6.2 million online. The New York Times California Newsom signs California redistricting plan to counter Texas Republicans. The New York Times climate change, the unseen health dangers of floodwaters. The New York Times economy, how Trump is shaking trust in the economy and judge orders alligator Alcatraz shut down. The New York Times economy, how long can this uncanny stock market prosper? The New York Times economy opinion, Trump is a master at creating uncertainty. 3 experts try to make sense of the economy. The New York Times energy source, Brazil-US talks on mining rare earth minerals are complicated by the Trump tariffs. The New York Times games, how monopoly and the Sims reflect the housing market. The New York Times Fed and Trump, Jerome Powell suggests Fed will soon cut interest rates in Jackson Hole speech. The New York Times Fed and Trump behind the Powell big gamble in final Jackson Hole speech. The New York Times Fed and Trump taking on the Fed. Trump combines retribution tactics with a power play. The New York Times Fed and Trump threatens to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook if she does not resign. The New York Times Fed and Trump attacks on the Fed and BLS threaten key source of economic strength. The New York Times games, the billion-dollar game built in a dorm room. The New York Times Massachusetts Democrats, is Massachusetts a gerrymandered state? The New York Times media, Howard Stern helped make SiriusXM billions. Can podcasts do the same? The New York Times media, these comics got caught up in politics, now they are getting personal. The New York Times medicine and science, Trump budget offices withholding IV funds that Congress appropriated. The New York Times medicine and science, Supreme Court lets Trump administration cut NIH grants for disfavored research. The New York Times Minnesota Democratic Party revokes endorsement of mayoral candidate. The New York Times Nature, why does it seem like jellyfish are all over the East Coast? The New York Times RFK Junior, flying blind, Trump strips government of expertise at a high stakes moment. The New York Times RFK Jr. as Trump weighs IVF, Republicans back new natural approach to infertility. The New York Times RFK Jr. opinion, Maha is a bad answer to a good question. The New York Times science, Trump cuts may spell the end for the only Antarctic research ship from America. The New York Times Texas opinion, the Trump gerrymandering push is a form of cheating. The New York Times Texas and California race forward with rival redistricting efforts. The New York Times Trump opinion, the rise of right-wing nihilism. The New York Times Trump, how Tiffany the Trump husband benefited from proximity to power. The New York Times Trump, how Trump used 10 emergency declarations to justify hundreds of actions. The New York Times Trump FBI plans to lower recruiting standards, alarming agents. The New York Times Trump FBI searches home and office of John Bolton, former Trump advisor. Live updates. The New York Times Trump members of Congress seek to expand sports diplomacy. The New York Times Trump, the NOAM spending rule causes delays at Homeland Security Department. The New York Times Trump year will end with 300,000 fewer federal workers. Trump official says. The New York Times United Kingdom business, British government to rescue another ailing steel maker. The New York Times Europe, US and EU agree on details of trade deal. Trump administration. Live updates. The New York Times Ukraine, no meeting plan between Putin and Zelensky. Top Russian diplomat says. The New York Times Ukraine has Russia advanced. Ukrainians use this online map to check every morning. The New York Times Ukraine works to identify 6,000 bodies sent from Russia in makeshift rail platform lab. The New York Times Ukraine Vance recounts telling Zelensky to behave in Trump meeting. The New York Times Ukraine, Zelensky says US talks brought a very important advance. The New York Times headlines. The Guardian, August 27, 2025 air pollution. Burning Man attendees face more weather woes as thunderstorms loom. Burning Man festival. The Guardian, air pollution deforestation has killed 500,000 people in past 20-year study finds deforestation. The Guardian, air pollution, United Kingdom the richest in the UK set to produce 13 times more transport emissions than poorest by 2035 carbon footprints. The Guardian, California Trump administration pulls another $175 million from high-speed rail in California. Trump administration. The Guardian, Fed and Trump Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook to sue Trump administration over its attempt to fire her Federal Reserve. The Guardian, Fed and Trump is out to end the autonomy of the Fed. Here is how he is trying to get his way. Federal Reserve. The Guardian, music, I Am the One to Beat is the showgirl era of Taylor Swift set to propel pop megastar to even greater heights. Taylor Swift. The Guardian, music, no need to calm down, how the Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce engagement broke the internet. Taylor Swift. The Guardian, music, Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce announce engagement on social media. Taylor Swift. The Guardian, music, teenager convicted over IS-inspired plot to attack Taylor Swift concert. Taylor Swift. The Guardian, nature, primates with longer thumbs tend to have bigger brains. Research finds evolution. The Guardian, nature, toothless sharks. Ocean acidification could erode the vital weapon of the predator. Study finds ocean acidification. The Guardian, plastic surgery and Trump. Mar-a-Lago face the mega plastic surgery trend. The week plastic surgery and Trump. Why does the mega elite love conspicuous cosmetic surgery? Arwa Madawi. The Guardian, Texas NAACP sues Texas over congressional redistricting, saying it strips black voters of political power. Texas. The Guardian, universities. Trump says he wants nothing less than $500 million from Harvard as feud continues. Harvard University. The Guardian, Utah Democrats. Utah redistricting, what to know about the order to redraw congressional maps. Utah. The Guardian World Trump threatens tariffs on countries that discriminate against U.S. tech Trump tariffs. The Guardian Greenland Denmark summons U.S. charge of affairs over alleged attempts to interfere with the Greenland status. Europe Live South America and Africa and Asia Trump tariffs are reshaping old alliances as the global south plots its own path. Trump tariffs. The Guardian Brazil judge orders round-the-clock surveillance of flight risk. Bolsonaro Jair Bolsonaro. The Guardian United Kingdom and Europe right-wing Tories in reform offer only easy answers. In snake oil on UK-EU relationship minister warns. UK Politics Live Europe after a summer of submission to Trump. Europe knows it must defend Ukraine and itself. Alone Paul Taylor. The Guardian France faces new political crisis as PM expected to lose confidence. Vote France. The Guardian India Trump imposes 50% tariff on India as punishment for buying Russian oil. Trump tariffs. The Guardian Headlines. The Guardian August 26, 2025 Air pollution. Fossil fuel extractors bend the world to there will help fund the journalism that exposes them. George Monbiot. The Guardian Business Postal services around the world suspend deliveries to U.S. How will it affect you? Trump tariffs. The Guardian California. Gavin Newsom is taking the fight to Trump, but for whom is he fighting? Arwa Madawi. The Guardian California. What the Democrats can learn from Gavin. The Newsom-Trump mockery. Katrina vanden Heuvel. The Guardian Illinois. Democrats condemn the Trump plans to send National Guard to Chicago as unconstitutional. Chicago. The Guardian Illinois governor hits back after Trump mocks his weight. It takes one to know one. U.S. News. The Guardian Music. Everything We Do is Music by Elizabeth Alper. Review how the classics shape pop music. Books. The Guardian Trump and Sports. The Infantino latest Oval Office show reminds us Trump will be inescapable at the 2026 World Cup. 2026. The Guardian Trump Republicans are trying to ensure we will never have another fair election. Judith Levine. The Guardian Trump officials puts FEMA staffers on leave for signing open letter criticizing administration. Live Headlines. The Guardian August 24, 2025 Air pollution. States vow to fight the Trump official stop work order on offshore wind farm. U.S. News. The Guardian Air pollution. Wildfires in California and Oregon grow, prompting evacuations and warnings. U.S. News. The Guardian Air pollution. Do not let Donald Trump undermine your faith in the climate fight. Gina McCarthy. The Guardian California. No holds barred fight. The California governor takes office. Loves to punch back at Trump. California. The Guardian California governor has become an anti-Trump comedian. It is 2017 all over again. Dave Schilling. The Guardian Democrats do not like joining in why it could be your superpower. Health and well-being. The Guardian Fed and Trump pattern of lawfare. Trump is targeting opponents with mortgage fraud claims. Donald Trump. The Guardian Illinois. Trump a manufactured crisis to justify plan to send National Guard to Chicago. Leading Democrat says Trump administration. The Guardian. Maine Democrat. This Maine oysterman thinks Democrats are doing jack about fascism, so he is running for U.S. Senate. Maine. The Guardian Media. South Park has become the most important TV show of the Trump 2.0 era. South Park. The Guardian music composer John Williams says he never liked film music very much. John Williams. The Guardian Trump and Epstein fallout. Memoir of Epstein accuser Virginia Giuffre. To be published posthumously. Jeffrey Epstein. The Guardian Trump at home and abroad. U.S. policy chaos has one constant: the Trump self-interest. Donald Trump. The Guardian Trump presidential philosophy is government by shakedown. Stephen Greenhouse. The Guardian Canada finally faces a basic question: how do we defend ourselves? Stephen Marquet. The Guardian United Kingdom. Riverford. Autistic vegan man. People just lie. How the Riverford guy Singh Watson became the most brutally honest farmer in Britain. Farming. The Guardian Ukraine and Europe. The Zelensky European bodyguards, which leaders join Trump talks in Washington. Ukraine. The Guardian Ukraine. Pentagon has blocked Ukraine from striking deep inside Russia. Report Trump administration. The Guardian Ukraine. Russia says the leaders of Europe do not want peace in Ukraine, as Vance says U.S. will keep trying. U.S. foreign policy. The Guardian Headlines. The Guardian August 22, 2025 Air pollution. Europe. EU wildfires worst on record as burning season continues. Wildfires. The Guardian air pollution. Scientists call for action to address air pollution from space launches. Environment. The Guardian Florida removes rainbow crosswalk honoring victims of Pulse nightclub shooting. Florida. The Guardian Games. All will rise. The game empowering players to tackle real-world problems. Games. The Guardian Media. Satire at its finest. South Park takes on the Trump Marshall takeover. AI and tech bros. South Park. The Guardian Nature. Bee buffets. The pollinator pathways turning drab alleys into insect havens. Insects. The Guardian Nature. Wolf hunting in western U.S. does little to prevent livestock losses. Study finds hunting. The Guardian RFK Junior. As measles gains ground in U.S. Texas offers lessons from its outbreak. U.S. healthcare. The Guardian Trump government workers are canary in coal mine for Trump bid to gut union rights. Leaders warn Trump administration. The Guardian Trump presidential philosophy is government by shakedown. Stephen Greenhouse. The Guardian Wyoming Media. 7 Wyoming newspapers were about to be shut. They were given a second life. Wyoming. The Guardian Ukraine. The Guardian view on Trump and Zelensky. Ukraine deserves better than we feared. Editorial. The Guardian Ukraine European show of unity at the White House is a plus for Ukraine, but peace is still a distant dream. Andrei Kirchhoff. The Guardian Russia by sanctioning journalists. The Kremlin admits how much the truth hurts. Raphael Bear. The Guardian Russia. Prigozhin knew he was doomed after failed rebellion, says mother Yevgeny Prigozhin. The Guardian Ukraine attacks pipeline that sends Russian oil to Hungary and Slovakia. Ukraine. The Guardian India scales back plan to remove stray dogs from streets of Delhi. India. The Guardian India people versus tigers evicted Indian tribe camp in reserve to reclaim ancient lands. Global development. The Guardian Headlines. The Guardian August 21, 2025 Air pollution. Michigan. A coal-fired plant in Michigan was to close, but Trump forced it to keep running. Fossil fuels. The Guardian Air pollution. You be the judge. Should my flat mates stop burning incense in our home life and style? The Guardian California legislature poised to vote on redistricting plan in response to Texas gerrymandering. California. The Guardian California Supreme Court rejects Republican effort to stop redistricting as legislature seeks vote on plan. Live courts and Trump the umpire who picked a side. John Roberts and the death of rule of law in America. U.S. Supreme Court. The Guardian Democrats. We criminalize the political stunt at our peril. It is a crucial art form that is impossible to ignore. Mark Borkowski. The Guardian Media satire at its finest. South Park takes on the Trump Marshall takeover. AI and tech bros. South Park. The Guardian RFK Junior. Existential threat. U.S. health workers call Kennedy Jr. a risk to public health. Kennedy Jr., The Guardian. Texas redistricting. How new Republican maps will hurt Democrats. Texas, The Guardian. Europe. Donald Trump is becoming the greatest unifier of Europe since the end of the Cold War. Fabrizio Tassinari, The Guardian. Ukraine. Trump needs to understand what the war in Ukraine is really about. Kenneth Roth, The Guardian. Ukraine. Trump steps back from Russia and Ukraine peace talks for now. Sources say Donald Trump. The Guardian. Cat's corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. Saying the quiet part out loud. Roar. Hi, I am Tiger. Our human asked us to get up from our naps and start Cat's Corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. She gave us a list of internet allies which we will post for her here.
Hi, I am Leone. It is better for your mental fitness to go to these websites than to go to bro sites for advice. Substack letters from an American Heather Cox Richardson. Substack your local epidemiologist. The Midas Touch. The Guardian. The New York Times.
One introduction. RFK. The United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only for home building and furniture building. For just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry, and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree. But it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen, and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burned tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lung, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom. The Eco-Design Wood Stove International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. RFK. Purple air. PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.